1974, we had just moved from California, where my father had recently graduated university, and one of his first jobs was with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Kennedy Space Center, Florida. And he was there to help essentially transition the NASA facilities from the Apollo era to the shuttle era. And so as a kid, that's pretty impressive when you're 6, 7 years old to say your dad's, a rocket scientist, It's also a hard act to follow, but it was a pretty cool, idyllic childhood where you almost took for granted that at any moment a glance towards the east, living in Titusville, Florida, would occasionally spot a golden flame in the sky rising towards the clouds while some Delta rocket or Atlas Centaur rocket was making its way towards the geostationary orbits around the Earth. And you took it for granted because it happened so often. And it was just really one of those cool things that happened. I think the first thing we got to see when I was a kid was the actual last flight of the Apollo program, which was the Apollo-Soyuz test project, where we joined up in space with the Soviet Union and their Soyuz capsule and met in space American astronauts and Russian astronauts for the first time. So that was a completely jazz-like experience for me. And at some point, though, the last flight, 1975, of Apollo-Soyuz and the first flight of shuttle, which took place in 1981, there was a big gap. And as a kid, that gap of 5 or 6 years is a lifetime and a half between manned spaceflight launches. So as we got closer and closer to the first flight of Columbia, the program was picking up, and one of the things they decided to do was do a main engine test firing of the shuttle on the launch pad. And my brother and I were very excited about that. The problem had been, though, is that we had moved from Titusville, and if you know your Florida geography, Titusville is kind of on the east coast, whereas Orlando is more inland. And although you could occasionally see a rocket off in the distance leaving Cape Canaveral from Orlando, almost anywhere in Orlando you can still see it, it didn't have that same sense of emotion because it was so distant. And in Titusville you could hear the rockets, the actual sonic booms as it flew into space. And so despite that lack of distance, we figured to ourselves, my brother and I, that if we only were able to climb onto the roof of our house in Orlando, that somehow or another we'd be able to see, based on the additional height, to the east coast, where we could see at least, if nothing else, the column of smoke that would be expected from the main engine test firing of the shuttle main engines. So it was one of those days where everybody was at work except for me and him. For some reason, he was at school, or we were off of school that day. Parents were at work. Of course, my dad's actually like in the test firing room, with the countdown, the whole bit and stuff. We knew, of course, we were not allowed to be, using father's tools or, father's anything, let alone ladders and stuff. But we got in ourselves that we could do this, seemingly to get away with it. And we took the expanding ladder, the kind that kind of folds out completely, if you will. I hate to do this kind of graphic that won't show up on a recording, but it's the kind that's an A-frame ladder that folds out to one long ladder. And apparently it's not, you can't just open the ladder and put it up against a building and then get up the ladder, because you actually have to have a certain angle to it, because if it's too much close to 90 degrees, it's going to want to collapse on itself. And so I got my brother to go up first onto the roof of the house, while I held the ladder stable, and then of course with myself climbing up the ladder, there was nothing to hold it stable. So as I got to the roof, it must have seemed very much John Belushi-ish, or that whole sense was that the ladder is pulling away from the house, and you're scratching at the asphalt tiles of the roof, trying to grab onto something, but you're going down. and very Buster Keaton, so I guess is the other reference I'm trying to think of. And sure enough, I fall the 10, 15 feet it is from the roof of the house onto the ground. And of course, I don't hit the ground in a nice soft piece of grass, but I managed to hit a piece of concrete on the ground. And I knocked myself out. And when I come to moments later, it was not a long thing, the first thing that you sense as you come to is this hysterical laughter coming from somewhere. And it's my brother laughing his head off on the roof of the house, because to him, I'm sure, it seemed very comical, cartoon-like, to have me suddenly disappear from view as the ladder collapsed. I probably would have done the same thing in his shoes. And anyway, in my deluded state, because I mean, I was, you know, in and out of consciousness, and was what I thought was sweating was in fact blood pouring from the top of my head, pretty out of it. So my first concern was, well, I better take care of the bleeding. So I went to the house and found an ice pack and put it on there. Meanwhile, again, through the house, I hear the hysterical laughter. It's nonstop laughing on the roof of the house. And so I said to myself as I lied down on the couch with this thing on my head, I'll let him sit up there for a little while, you know, wait till the laughing stops before I go get him. And, you know, 5 minutes became 10 minutes, became a half hour, became about 2 hours. And, you know, the laughter turned to, hey, hey, come back. And I don't know, I felt like I was kind of teaching them a lesson. I don't know why I felt like that. But it must have been maybe a good 3.5, 4 hours before I finally rescued my brother off the roof of the house. And this is in the, you know, noonday sun. I mean, first of all, we missed the whole shuttle thing. I mean, that whole thing went out the window. And this is, again, he has spent the majority of a, you know, summer day on the roof of the house in Florida, you know, the sun beaming off the tile roof and whatnot, before I go ahead and reset up the ladder and let him down. And of course, now, of course, he's toasted. He is absolutely red and brown, burned to a crisp and stuff. And I have a huge gash on my head, and we're like, what are we going to tell our parents and stuff? So dinner came along that night, and it was one of those awkward dinners, you know, where things are quiet and our parents are sensing something is not quite right, you know? And so they didn't know how to bring it up exactly, so they asked my brother, how come are you so brown? You know, this is, my parents are from Cuba, so that's the accent. And then it's like, oh, well, he was outside playing outside all day and, you know, he just lost track of time or whatever. And of course, I have my hair combed forward like this to cover the gash, you know. And my parents are like, how come you have your hair this way? And I'm like, well, I'm looking at something different or whatever, keeping my head down, you know, looking for a different style. And like, oh, how come there is spots of blood leading into the house? And we're like, oh, yeah. That's because we had a barbecue today, and we had some meat laying out, and we cooked it before, and we must have spilled some meat. Okay. And we all go about our eating quietly, and, you know, it's one of those things where it's like, man, we never got away with anything as kids growing up. Our parents were on it. But I think this might have been one of those times where it's even too overwhelming for them to address. So it's one of those things they actually let slide. And it was one of those things that as an adult, 20 years later, you confess to your parents, like, you know that time you saw that blood on the floor? Well, actually, I had fallen off the roof. And they're like, what? You know? So anyway, that was just, I think, one of many, as it turns out, later in life, because you would think I would learn, but one of many bad ideas I've had throughout the life. So.